September 10th, Planning Commission meeting. Let's do our Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Roll call.
All right, roll call. Commissioner Moore,
Here.
Commissioner Fong,
Present.
Vice Chair Saxena,
Present.
Chairperson Wang.
Here.
Commissioner Takahashi is absent today.
All right. Very cool. All right, well, welcome everybody. We have oral communications. Should you have something to say, please pick up a blue card. You've got 3 minutes or so to actually present what you want to say. These are items that are not on the agenda. The items that are on the agenda, please pick up a card then as well. So. We've got 2 cards coming, so for those watching on TV, thank you. Well, don't sit down so quickly. Jennifer Griffin. So please come up.
She was up there before I was. Hello, City, good Lord, I don't know where I am, Planning Commission. Hi, I'm Jennifer Griffin. And I just wanted to mention one thing. First of all, I won't talk about Highway 17, but they are actively taking down dead trees and vegetation along the road, so I'm very, very happy. They're holding up traffic, but it's in a good way. The other thing I was going to say is, it has come to several people's attention that at the beginning of August, the governor of Oregon signed HB 2001, which essentially allows, for most instances, in every city in Oregon, a duplex, a triplex, or a fourplex on an R1 city lot. There are certain restrictions in that, I believe. I think the cities have to be over 20,000 people, and then since there is quite a large rural area, I think that it was over 10,000 for certain rural communities. Oregon is unique in that Portland is by far the largest city in the state. The capital is Salem. There are some prominent universities. HB 2001 was introduced in January by the Speaker of the House, who is from Portland, and it was implemented into law within 7 months. I know people who live in Portland who did not even know that this law had been introduced. They're still stupefied and dumbfounded. There are other people in other cities that don't understand what is going on. Immediately after the bill was introduced in January, Eugene, which is the home of University of Oregon, the Ducks, immediately put a ban on this bill. Now, we're talking about a city that has some of the best intellectual people in the state, is Eugene. The governor of Oregon saw fit to disregard the city of Eugene's rationale for saying this HB 2001 was a bad bill for Eugene, and it's a bad bill for Oregon. Right now, the Eastmoreland neighborhood, which is adjacent to Reed College, which looks like Cambridge, England, this is where Steve Jobs went to college, it is unprotected. It is going to be destroyed by HB 2001. Even now, residents of Portland and Eastmoreland are trying to protect their neighborhoods. We stand with Portland and Eugene. HB 2001, let's hope, does never pass in California. Thank you.
Okay, all the other ones here are for reach code, so we'll wait for that. Given that we did not have a meeting last session, we don't have any minutes. And so anything on the consent calendar? I think nothing. So let's bring on our guest and do study session item number 1, which is presentation on our adoption of REACH codes, possible adoption of REACH codes, building codes more stringent than state standard, Title 24, Part 6, Energy, and Part 11, Cal Green. Recommended action, receive presentation, provide comments. So let's welcome our staff.
Thank
What do we
you.
have today?
Thank you, Chair Wayne and Commissioners Ben Fu, Director of Community Development. City Council added this item onto the Sustainability Commission's adopted fiscal year 2019-2020 work program. Subsequently, the Sustainability Commission discussed this item at its August 19th meeting and provided feedback to staff to consider options. Today we have Andre Duvort, the Sustainability Manager, here to present to you for your information as well as keeping you informed of related projects and development in the city. And seek your, just providing a presentation and see if you have any comments for us to take back to the Sustainability Commission prior to moving forward to the City Council. So with that, we'll let Andre introduce himself, and we have a brief presentation for you. Thank you.
Hello, Commissioners. Thanks for having me today. My name is Andre Dervord. I'm a newly hired Sustainability Manager here for the city.
Welcome.
Reporting to the City Manager's office, so looking forward to working with you all. Today I'll give a brief presentation. I wanted to give you an overview of the City of Cupertino's Climate Action Plan at a high level, to give you a little bit of context for this ask that's been put on the Sustainability Commission's work program for this year, as Ben mentioned. I'll keep that pretty high level, and then we do have a program lead with Silicon Valley Clean Energy who's going to give us a little bit of detail specifically on what our neighboring cities in Silicon Valley are considering on this topic, and looking forward to hearing your feedback. Just the context here, high level, is that the Cupertino Climate Action Plan was adopted in 2015. This is pursuant to California AB 32, which directed municipalities and local jurisdictions to develop plans to address carbon emissions and more or less match what the state level targets are for meeting greenhouse gas emission targets all the way out to 2050. So Council adopted the local CAP Climate Action Plan in 2015. And it contains a wide range of measures to address both city municipal greenhouse gas emissions as well as community-wide greenhouse gas emissions. I'll give you a brief overview of where we stand in those targets a little bit later. One of the items as well is that there is a sustainability element in the city's general plan that goes out to 2040. That has informed a little bit of the work that we've done here, especially in analyzing the impact of what potential building codes might do to help our greenhouse gas emissions. Another item that I'd mention is that we are a member agency of Silicon Valley Clean Energy. Silicon Valley Clean Energy is a community choice electricity aggregator. The mission of SVCE and the other community choice aggregators is to provide local control over retail electricity purchases. John Sepp is here to represent SVCE and will give us a little overview from their perspective. Also, I'll mention that in 2018, the Cupertino City Council adopted a climate emergency resolution, which really places a bit of urgency on the actions that we have in our climate action plan. So that's a little bit of context for you. Our city's goals are to reduce greenhouse gases 15% by 2020, 49% by 2035, and 83% by 2050, and I'll show you where we are in that forecast. So what is a REACH code? A REACH code is, again, as Ben mentioned, a Sustainability Commission work program item. The scope of it is any building that is looking to get a building permit. There's currently nothing in our current plans to address planning or land use. However, that is a possibility that the Sustainability Commission might bring back to this body at a future date. So the questions we're asking in the public outreach process right now are, how can a building reach code best support and complement the climate action plan measures, and how might it best mitigate the greenhouse gas emissions in this code cycle. And a code cycle is every 3 years. 2019 will be the code cycle starting in January 1st, 2020. So reach codes essentially set up a reach beyond the base building code. So Title 24 refers to the entire state of California municipal code governing how buildings are constructed and designed. And a reach code essentially takes the base building code and goes to ask for higher performing items. Specifically, when we're talking about an energy reach code, for example, we can ask builders and architects to design a building that is, say, 5 or 10 or 15% above the Title 24 standards. That's one example of an energy reach code. Other reach codes that are adopted today in the state of California address things like solar photovoltaic installation at the time of a new building going up, energy and water efficiency requirements. Construction waste management is an element of the California Green Building Code, which is Title 24, Part 11. These are all the more commonly adopted reach codes today in the state of California. And Silicon Valley Clean Energy, and as well as other CCAs in the state of California, have an interest in looking at electrification, which we will talk about the cost effectiveness studies and why the impulse to go electric versus fossil fuels has an obvious impact on our greenhouse gas emissions. The other communities, about 50 communities are considering reach codes right now for the 2019 code cycle, which is a really unprecedented in my time in this industry. I'll show you on this next slide. This shows you all the statewide approved reach codes going back to 2015. So these are all the cities that have approved and adopted reach codes and their scope, going back to when the practice became more common in the 2016 code, and that's all of them. So the fact that there's 50 cities considering or have already adopted reach code for 2019 code cycle really says a lot about the public interest in this topic. The examples that we'll talk about a little bit include Menlo Park, San Jose, Mountain View, Sunnyvale, and several others in the Silicon Valley area. Here's a look at where we are. I wanted to give this body and the public an idea of what the greenhouse gas emissions really look like in our community. This is a chart that shows our greenhouse gas inventory going back to 2010. And we do our inventory every 3 years. So you can see we have 2010, 2015, and 2018 represented on this chart. And the target is there in the green bar.
Is that, just a quick question here, is that by the total amount of emissions or is that by populace?
This is total.
Okay.
So what you're looking at on this chart is an absolute amount, and our target is also measured in absolute reduction.
Oh, it's not by population.
Correct.
So if you add more people in the area and it goes up, or if you do a better job reducing it, but it doesn't matter how many people you have.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah. And the next slide will illustrate that a little bit as we look at the forecast.
Got it.
But you can see here the component parts of our carbon emissions, and as you can see, and this is fairly common for cities in California and the Bay Area. Transportation forms a fair amount of the carbon emissions, and that's all of the on-road and off-road vehicles. Natural gas consumption is the next bar there, electricity, and then the top bars are solid waste and wastewater emissions. And what I'll note here is that since 2010, we have met our 2020 target as of the 2018 year. And that's exciting news for us. It shows the impact that we've had since adopting the Climate Action Plan. So the goal has been we're at 15% right now was the goal, and we're at 24% reduction since that baseline year.
By the way, all these
Yes.
numbers are for the include all residents also.
Correct. This is looking at the entire community.
Okay. Thanks.
Yep, good question. Another notable item here is that electricity has gone from making up about 25% of total emissions in 2010 to only less than 2% of total emissions in the 2018 inventory. A major reason for this is the adoption of the Community Choice Energy Program with Silicon Valley Clean Energy. One of their main purposes is to source and purchase carbon-free or low-carbon electricity sources. And in our carbon accounting practices, you can see the real impact that this has.
Excuse me, Andre, could you explain, or do you have a theory for why natural gas has increased from 2015 to 2018?
Good question. So I'll mention that these are draft numbers. We're working with a consultant right now to finalize these numbers. But one of the major increases in natural gas, you'll see here, I'll read you the numbers off the chart here, is that natural gas consumption has increased by 14% overall if you're comparing 2018 with the 2015 inventory. This is mostly shown up in the non-residential consumption of natural gas. So that's all I can say at this time. We'll have more detail as we work with the consultant on looking into these numbers further.
So if PG&E uses more gas-fired plants, will it show up here or in the electricity?
It will not. So this is the boundary of this report here is within the Cupertino city limits. And so the carbon accounting practices in this industry, we set a boundary. And so any emission that occurs here, so when we're talking about natural gas, we're talking about just stationary sources of natural gas combustion, such as buildings is the major one. So buildings, industrial processes, anything that's burning natural gas or otherwise utilizing natural gas within the Cupertino city limits. Same with the electricity portion. What you're referring to would be captured on the state level, looking at the utility level renewable portfolio standard, and that has no bearing on our particular emissions. We have effectively divorced our electricity carbon emissions from the PG&E grid, now that we're purchasing our electric from SVCE for the most part.
Like as the city population and offices and buildings grow, this natural gas component, which is primarily heating, I presume.
Correct. Yes. In the building sector, the primary uses of natural gas are in heating a building, process loads for any industrial operations. Hospitals, for example, will use natural gas to create steam very commonly. Schools will use natural gas to heat their facilities. And in a home, natural gas is consumed mainly by cooking and water heating.
And home heating.
And home heating. It's less pronounced here compared to some other locations where it's colder, but yes, that's a major end use of natural gas in all building types. So we'll just, that data is informing the Sustainability Commission on what to do with the REACH code. I think that's all the items I wanted to show on this chart. Another thing I'd mention also is that transportation is now a larger share of total emissions in 2018. So as we see the electricity carbon emissions go down, the other items become much more important in the scheme of things. Now looking forward, this is our emissions forecast out to the target year of 2050. And I'll just explain here the different bars. The gray dotted line near the top here shows what we call the business as usual case. So this is if we stop doing any kind of carbon or mitigation actions today, the projected growth patterns of the city would create that carbon impact if we really had no mitigation measures at all. The blue line shows, and that's really not too useful. It's just it's a baseline that we create to be consistent with state forecasting practice. the business as usual line is the blue line there. That's really showing if the city were just to, for example, ride the wave of the state policies, for example, cars becoming more efficient with the fuel standards, the base building code that I mentioned going into effect, and other things that the state is doing to impact carbon emissions. That's the blue line. Our target reduction path is the green, and this is the target reduction path that the city of Cupertino has set for ourselves.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yes.
How hard would it be to actually calculate this by population, to see what it was by populace? And
Not
by,
hard.
And by square footage of office space?
Not hard at all.
So if we had to project what it might be in the future, we could actually see those as well in those projections?
That-
Like if we added
that's-
10,000 more residents, or if we added like 10 million more square footage of office or retail?
Correct, yes. And the business as usual case takes that into account using data in the general plan.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question. Does this also include that in 2020, all the new homes in California must have solar panels?
Correct. That would be reflected in the blue line there, business as usual with state policies.
Like the targets in the green, they were based on the recommendation of the Sustainability Commission?
Correct, yes. This is the adopted target plan that was informed by the state targets and adopted for the city of Cupertino.
And just going by past history, where we have the red line, would the blue line, if we had gone back, been above it, below it? Like, if you have any idea?
Could you repeat your question?
Like, we are projecting forward the blue line, which says if you follow the state policies, this is what's going to happen. And we also have the red line, which starts from 2010 to where we are right now. If we had just followed with the state policies, would we have been below where we are, or?
That's a good question. I believe we wouldn't be in as good a position if we had just followed the state policies. And one of the major reasons is that we didn't have to become a part of Silicon Valley Clean Energy. That was not a state mandated action. That's something that the city of Cupertino, as well as our neighboring jurisdictions, chose to become a part of in the Joint Powers Authority. That has really created a big part of that red line and drop.
And by the way, Ben, I need to erase this, so I have. Okay, thank you.
So what are our next steps in this process? So the Sustainability Commission has formed a subcommittee to study this topic further. Staff is looking to publish a draft ordinance as soon as October 9th. We are hosting a public outreach event on October 16th, which will advertise widely. We're doing targeted stakeholder outreach as well. That's ongoing. The idea is to get as much public input on this process as we can. We're hoping to have a staff report and recommended ordinance by November for a first council reading in early November. And if all goes well, a second council reading and a vote in the month of December. And we're moving on this time frame because the council has directed the Sustainability Commission to adopt any REACH code to become effective, coincident with the rest of the building standards. As I mentioned, begin enforcement January 2020. That's my presentation. Now we'll invite John up here, if you don't mind.
Actually, I had a couple of questions. Should I hold those until after the other presentation, or?
Go ahead.
Okay. So I'm curious, if you could go back to the page that had the chart of emission rates. This is the one that showed the decrease over time. Yeah, this one. So I'm curious, there's actually a significant decrease in the electrical emissions related, greenhouse gas related to electrical. Is there a reason for that? This is before the adoption of Silicon Valley Clean Energy, right?
Correct, yeah. And that's a good question, and I'll probably want to get back to you with a more detailed answer.
Yeah. Okay.
My initial thought is that the state grid has been getting progressively cleaner over time, and we've been taking advantage of that just by virtue of purchasing energy through the grid.
Yeah. And then it's interesting, can we go to the next slide? There's probably a way to answer this between the two. I'm curious at the level that we are at today, which is below the 2020 target, where does that intersect in terms of the target, on our green line here? I'm curious what year we've attained at this point in our 2018 number.
We have met our 2020 goal
Yeah.
a couple years
but
early.
we're beyond that, right?
By a bit, yeah.
Yeah, by a bit. So
Yeah, and that's
it's-
illustrated
it looks
here.
like it's whatever, 260,000 tons. If you flip to the next page, I wonder if 270, well, it's interesting. We're on the other side there. Okay. There's an interesting question, if you're ahead of the near-term target, at what point are we, in the longer one? And then I was actually going to say, if you could flip to the next, and actually, I think, hold on this slide. One of the things I think that's been notable, it's been reported, the state has done quite well on its greenhouse gas emission reduction, largely because you can reduce power plant emissions pretty effectively through regulation. So I guess the difference, is it appropriate to say that the difference between the blue line and the green line, is that pretty much reflecting that it's difficult to reduce transportation emissions? I think that, I'd read a thing that had said that was actually the challenge for the state. At this point, you can't really make plants cleaner. And that means you have to work on cars, which is hard.
Yeah, I would agree with that assessment. Looking back at this, I think is the most informative way to consider that problem, is that both transportation and natural gas now represent the lion's share of our carbon emissions. Remember that emissions is an ongoing rate. It's measured in a rate in tons per year. So the fact that in the year 2018 we still have such a large carbon emissions rate occurring every year says a lot about the impacts that has on global climate change. And that's really the focus of the public attention today in the state of California's policy development. And it is true that electricity, we have seen a great drop in emissions rates thanks to our participation in Silicon Valley Clean Energy. However, that leaves us with the harder challenge of addressing both natural gas consumption and transportation emissions, which are there's nothing that I know of that's going to create a single impact as we have seen in the electricity sector.
Great. Thank you.
Andre, real quick. If I remember AB 32 correctly, that's we have to get to 1990 levels. Is that still the case?
Yeah, the baseline was 1990, and that is the milestone that we've achieved in the year 2018.
Okay, so we've already hit those numbers.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that
I
was
just
our
wanted to make
that was
sure.
our 2020 goal, was
Okay.
to reach 1990 levels,
Yep.
if I'm not mistaken. But we're on target, I think, is the story here. But we still have a fair amount of challenging activities ahead of us.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation.
Thank you. Okay, John, I'll pull up here.
Great. Thank you, Commissioners. My name is John Supp with Silicon Valley Clean Energy, and thank you residents and businesses here of Cupertino. It's a pleasure to speak with you here today about the REACH Code effort. I've personally been working on this now for, well, more than a year. We began socializing this concept of REACH codes with the sustainability managers of our cities since, about April of 2018. And so it's been a long process, and it's been an exciting one. And I just want to give you a little bit of an update on where we are, what this is all about, and where we go from here. And I think as Andre pointed out in the last presentation, there is still a large remaining effort that's going to have to go into buildings and transportation. And so REACH codes in this case actually affect both of those. So we'll take a look at what's going on there. So as a community choice agency, our job here is to support our cities through local investment. And so one of the investments was this REACH code effort. And as we looked at how buildings could contribute to those natural gas reductions and transportation reductions, It's interesting that building code can actually affect transportation emissions, which we'll see in a second. That it turns out there's a couple of benefits when we started looking at all electric buildings. How could we use the code to encourage developers to pick a pathway that was better for emissions, which was the primary driver, but also has the side benefits of it being economically viable, often economically better at the construction side, as well as being healthier, lowers indoor emissions. You're not combusting fossil fuels inside, which we are doing in our homes quite frequently with cooking and space heating. And then there's some safety aspects of this as well. And as it relates to transportation, as an EV driver myself, I can tell you one of the biggest needs for driving electric vehicles is ready access to electric vehicle charging. Vast majority of people charge at home. Second largest group charge in their offices. And then a very small minority of people are charging solely at public charging stations. So thinking about how the code impacts EV charging infrastructure is also extremely important to help with that, bending that transportation curve. So within the REACH code recommendations that we put together with our consulting group, one of the big principles was whatever we're recommending in our model codes are going to pass cost effectiveness. So if you're going to spend the money to do anything better than code, you're going to make that money back in terms of reduced utility bills. So that was key on the building side. Next thing that we had as a goal was to establish the highest possible cost-effective threshold for that. So it's still cost-effective, the numbers we put together, and the impact of that is to actually create an attractive option for developers to consider all electric buildings, which don't have actually a REACH code put on them. And I'm going to reinforce that over the next couple of slides. So a bunch of stuff on this slide here. We'll focus on the center portion of it, which is the all-electric, the dual fuel, and the mostly electric. Those are the three different code language pathways that we put together. So most importantly is an all-electric pathway. So this would be a building that's using electricity only for inside the shell of the building. So this doesn't include things outside of the building like pools and whatnot. This is all about what's happening inside the building. Space heating, water heating, cooking, processes, and so on. So we want to make sure there was a pathway for all electric buildings within the code. And I'll say this multiple times because it tends to get forgotten. There is no REACH built into the all electric pathway in our recommendations. So in other words, all you have to do if you build an all electric building is meet Title 24 base code. Now, each city is looking at that and adding individual things that they desire, possibly from Cal Green standards to add on top of that. So I'm not going to get into too much detail on that, but that's certainly an option for a city to pursue. But basic recommendation that all the cities are reviewing is to start with not asking anything more than code for all electric buildings. So the REACH code is really about what's happening for a building that's going to pick mixed fuel, right? Natural gas plus electricity. So we have a pathway for that dual fuel building, and then we built a supplemental one for residential only, which I would call mostly electric. And that's about committing to using electricity for space heating and water heating, which are the two largest carbon emissions for a residential building. So that still leaves natural gas for things like cooking or other supplemental things inside the home that might run on natural gas. But the primary driver in that is to create a code that allows people to still have gas for a few aspects of what they want to do. But again, primary driver inside the home would be electricity. All right. At the Environmental Commission meeting, we talked a little bit more about Cal Green and how that can be layered on top of some of these requirements to add additional aspects such as building materials, sourcing of materials, utilization of certified energy modelers, and so on. So, and that's something that I think Cupertino would be looking into. And then so I'll move on from there. So from a timeline perspective, as I said, we've been working with the cities for quite some time on this. We are sort of in the heart of this effort right now, which is the model code is out there. We've published it. Cities have been looking at it. The cost effectiveness studies are done. So it's really about cities coming together internally to create that recommendation from staff to bring to the external stakeholders and ultimately to bring to council. So we're right in the thick of it. We are committed to providing support not just for the stage we're at right now, which is the recommendations and the code adoption, but also to support the training and checklists for the building staff and the permit department after the REACH codes go into effect. So what's happening locally? Pretty exciting. I got a couple updates on this. If you look on the left-hand side for letters of intent, we offered each city the opportunity to, in a non-binding fashion, indicate if they were going to bring a REACH code in front of their council or board, respectively, for a vote. And the update on this slide is now 12 of 13 member agencies have committed to doing so. Santa Clara being the latest, County of Santa Clara being the latest, and that just happened today. So they'll be joining the group. Only Los Gatos is currently not considering a REACH code for this year. And we have a bunch of updates on the dates as well, but SVCE and or its consultants will be at each of these meetings that are on here to answer technical questions and help this process continue to move forward. So I thought it might be helpful just to do a quick brief. Is it appropriate for this one? Very quick. Okay, so if you look at the base code, you can build a building all electric or dual fuel. Simple as that. If you look on the dual fuel, there's one aspect of the current code which is already forward-looking into electrification, and that is if you put a natural gas water heater in, the code already requires you to pre-wire that location so that in the future you could put in an electric heat pump water heater, for example, and it would be much more cost-effective to do that than it would be to have to run circuitry and wire well after the fact. So from a REACH code perspective, again, our recommendation is for the electric side is no change. And on the natural gas side, it is, you can see some of the recommendations there. So again, it's up to the cities to sort of look at what is it that you can do that would encourage some number of developers in the shorter term to pick the all-electric pathway, again, because of its emissions benefits, its health benefits, safety, and construction cost savings. Briefly on the right, and again, you have access to all of this, is that mostly electric option, which basically trims down some of the requirements on it, as long as you agree that you're going to be using electricity for the space heating and the water heating, still allowing gas for some other aspects of it. So I want to wrap up with that. The actual code language, proposed code language is in here, which I don't think we need to go over here. You have access to the full proposal. But I do want to briefly mention that it also includes, for electric vehicles, right, code enhancement opportunities for that. This is a complicated chart, so I'll just say it in brief. Part 11 Cal Green already has a minimum recommendation. Santa Clara County is already one of the top adopters of EVs. So in effect, the code recommendation, which sort of reflects a average adoption rate across the state, is a bit low for Santa Clara County. So we are absolutely one of the top adopters. Over 20% of new vehicles being purchased and registered in this area in many of the cities are electric vehicles already. So the idea here for the REACH code is simple. Look at building types that are appropriate for what you're going to be developing, and shift one of the levers, one or more of the levers. Increase the quantity of chargers on site, increase the readiness, like how ready are they actually to be for charging, or increase the charging speed, or all three. And again, we've drafted language around that, and then the city is now reviewing it to figure out what's appropriate to them. And with that, I just want to wrap up and say that we're continuing to work with our city staff on how to get these proposals out in front of your councils as well as in front of the stakeholders. Thanks.
Thank you, John, for that. Any questions from council members? Commission members?
For the EV, what's the difference between ready, capable, and installed?
Sure. Let me go back to that slide. So on the right-hand side, I kind of created a little bit of a cheat that just indicates that capable would be the lowest level of requirement, ready would be sort of a middle, and then fully installed would be obviously the highest level of readiness. Capable is about having conduit and circuits in the main service panel. So it's, if you're going to have a parking lot, you're going to have some conduit running underneath it, but actually nothing else inside that conduit. It's just ready to pull. It's capable of having an EV charger at some point, but not at the current moment. Ready would be to actually having the circuit, the wire, and then an outlet on the end of it. That would be ready. Think of like a dryer outlet in your garage, right? That 3-prong big outlet. It would be something like that. That would be ready. And then fully installed would actually have a mounted charger physically located on the site. None of our recommendations actually have a mounted charger as part of it. We think that's a little, without knowing which electric vehicle the person's going to have, that seems to be a bit of an overreach.
Overreach?
Yeah. So we did not build any of that into any of the recommendations for any of the building types.
Two quick questions. First one is, why not a complete ban on natural gas in buildings
Yeah, great question.
as an option here?
Yeah. First of all, great question. That would be done outside of the actual REACH code, sort of a technical distinction. The energy portion is handled by the California Energy Commission.
CC, okay.
Right. And so we would have to follow a cost effectiveness study for a REACH code. A ban is utilizing a city's, a different power that a city has, typically the police power.
Police power, yep.
Yep. And that's what the city of Berkeley has done. So that is what they're doing. So it's certainly a possibility. It's just a different procedure from what we've been investigating.
Okay.
And then I think just a sub answer to that is, while it is wonderful to have a certain number of communities banning natural gas, imagine a situation where the entire state did it all in this code cycle, there may not be enough equipment, expertise, market awareness, all those other things. So it's sort of we need to make sure we have a runway to that rather than a cliff to do that type of massive market change.
Oh, okay, that's assuming our policymakers are smart about that. Second question is, which produces, in this city, which produces more of the greenhouse gases, the non-residential buildings or the residential buildings?
I'm not sure that I have that data.
We'll have to get that data to you in the results of our greenhouse gas inventory,
Okay, thanks.
which will be published as an item of interest to council in a coming meeting.
I had a question about the cost effectiveness of the measures. What kind of consumer education material do we have? So if somebody's going to buy a house, which is probably going to cost a bit more because there was some investment done to meet this, which over lifetime you will recover a lot more. So what kind of prediction and education material do we have to let consumers be aware and actually be willing to pay a premium for that?
Yeah, good question. So, for example, to build an all-electric home, it's actually the opposite. There is not a premium. There's actually a discount to build an all-electric home. And that's primarily driven by the fact you don't have to pay for gas service, gas line, additional internal venting, and so on. So just a home that we modeled multiple homes as part of the cost effectiveness study. For single-family homes, it's on the order of saving about $5,000 to build an all-electric home. Now, back to your question about awareness, that is not well known. It has been very challenging because of the state's commitment to natural gas to historically model all electric buildings. So it's been very difficult for someone to enjoy that potential first cost savings, right, until this code cycle. So this is really the first time, and I think this is a lot of the reasons why, as Andre mentioned, there's a lot of cities that are actually looking to take advantage of this moment to say, okay, let's go ahead and go in on some of this education and awareness. As part of this effort, we have put together a few customer-facing handouts that are available on a public website called SiliconValleyReachCodes.org. And then I would say that depending on what a city actually is doing, we would certainly get guidance from our cities and from our board to continue the education about the benefits of electrified homes and businesses. You'll see some of that as part of the SVCE's Resource Center, which is already put out to RFP. So we'll be building this online resource center to support these types of things. So yeah, we're actively involved in doing that as well.
Good, thanks.
I'm curious, you do mention the level 3 chargers on here just in passing. I'm just curious, is there a position in terms of the efficiency of, level 2 versus level 3? Are we better in the longer term having, fewer high capacity charge stations or many level 2?
Sure. So SVCE just recently won a multi-million-dollar grant from Cal EVIP, so we'll be doing some additional work on EV infrastructure for existing buildings as well. In terms of level 3, Clearly, there is a huge role for that and a big need. And I think where we're going to see that becoming even more important is for how we handle the existing multifamily buildings. It's very costly to dig up the concrete in a parking lot where there is no electrical service. So at least the way it's being looked at now is the ability to have some locally based level 3 chargers at high use areas. So whether they're parks or retail areas or whatnot, where people could go in and charge, get a good 80, 100 miles recharged in 15 minutes, and then have a lot more people cycling through those locations. So that is definitely a huge role. It's not in the code because the code doesn't know where your building's gonna go. And so we had to be really careful about saying, oh, you're a business, definitely put a level 3 charger in. Well, we don't know where that's going. So most of that level 3 is going to be done either by the customer developer saying this is a good idea and going above code, or for us or a city coming in after the fact, or a EV charger company coming in after the fact and saying, here's a really great corridor location for EV high-speed charging. So hugely a role.
So it's not something that was considered for, commercial standards or just not at this time, that kind of thing?
I think so we did consider it. So it actually was part of the evaluation. What you end up with is, except in certain use cases like retail, if you think of an office or a hotel, typically a vehicle is stationary for many hours at a time. And in level 3, you actually are going to only want to charge for 15 to 20 minutes at a time. So it's trying to find the right building type that is going to have these customers cycling through to take advantage of that ultra high speed charging. So there's really only a couple of use cases ones that make the most sense would be something like retail. But again, it's going to be really site dependent. So we did look at it, but yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so I do want to mention that, among the commissioners, we have about 5 electric vehicles, which would all be able to use like a Tesla high-speed charger, the superchargers. And at Main Street, Cupertino, there's about 10 supercharging stations. And what I've observed is a lot of times people will just stay in their car during the charge. But there is limited retail in that location, so people are going, to the coffee shops and that sort of thing, or just walking around. So the superchargers would be what you're talking about, this level 3. Is that correct? Okay.
Yes.
And so the city could require any new development to have these level 3 chargers installed if they wanted to?
A city absolutely has that ability to require that as part of the building code. Yes.
Okay.
And again, it would just be picking the right application of that.
Okay. And do you have some idea for the difference in time between this level 2 and level 3? Like a 200 mile charge. Do you have any idea?
Yeah. So it's usually at least squared. So at level 1, you're talking, say, I'll say 1 hour. About in 1 hour on a level 1, you'd be getting about 4 miles. On a level 2, you'd be getting about 16. And at a level 3, you'd be getting about 100 to, depending on how big of a fast charger, 200 miles back within that hour, sometimes even more. Some of the ultra fast chargers now are hundreds of kW, far exceeding most of what most vehicles can actually accept at this time. But you would have you'd be exceeding somewhere in the minimum of 100 miles per hour in the recharge speed, oftentimes going well above that.
Okay.
Yeah, most Teslas are running about 400 right now.
Yeah.
On a 120.
Yeah, so regarding the level 3, do all manufacturers support level 3 charging, or is it just Tesla?
I don't think I'm qualified to answer whether all do.
But is it just, because we only hear of Tesla superchargers, we don't hear of Nissan or...
So many manufacturers offer either options or as a standard, the ability to receive a level 3 charging plug into it. Unfortunately, there are a couple of designs, for example, like my car, the 2017 Bolt, did not come with that option. But you're gonna see that as either being standard or optional, but highly recommended with EVs moving forward.
Thank you.
So could you also, or could the city also require, if there's going to be some remodeling of the commercial building space, to go to a level 2 or 3 charger? Is that something else that they can add on easily? And then I do have a question. If the city, really wants to address the climate change and sea level rise, are you making a recommendation that is fairly simple? I know I went to the Sustainability Commission meeting, and it seemed as though that they could look at things a la carte, and that to me looked like it could get very complicated and take a long time. So if they were to, they wanted to be restrictive in a reasonable way, do you have a fairly simple recommendation for City Council?
Certainly. So what we have one option that's in here that is sort of a fixed. We call it option 2. It's the high reach code, and so all the language associated with that is already written. So a city could actually just review that exact option and go with it. So I would say that would be the simplest way to do it. I think feedback from a lot of cities is, we're confining our recommendations around just energy and EV charging. So other aspects that could be valuable to a city, such as construction material, recycled materials, are sort of outside of the scope of our recommendations. But there is a modular way to add those components onto it as well, and those sort of a menu of those already exist. So it's easy to take what we've provided and add on those Cal Green Tier 1 or Tier 2 options onto it. It may sound complicated. It's simple because it's all written out and ready to go for people if they want to use it.
Okay, so they could go with, for instance, option 2, the high reach code, and then add on Tier 2?
They could. You could add on aspects of Tier 1, aspects of Tier 2, the entire Tier 1 or the entire Tier 2 for a Cal Green.
Now, for Tier 1 and Tier 2, there was a chart which had different building sizes, and was that necessary, or could they just say we're going with Tier 2 and across the board regardless of what building size? So we're not going to say Tier 1 for this type of building, we're just going to say we're going with Tier 2 for everybody.
So because the city hired a consultant specifically for the Cal Green standards, I'm going to restrict my comments to what we did within the energy portion. Andre, if you have anything to add from the Cal Green consultant?
Yeah, I'll add that the Sustainability Commission's direction was to look at both electrification, as John laid out here, as well as Cal Green, which covers those other sustainability elements. For example, construction waste management, EV car charging. There's some model language in Cal Green that addresses EV car charging as well, water, et cetera. So the commission and subcommittee are considering both. Staff is treating them as one item because they're very much interrelated. And so the Sustainability Commission will be looking at both electrification as well as picking from one or more of those elements of Cal Green, as you mentioned.
I'll add quickly to Commissioner Moore's comment here. So if you wanted to go all Tier 2 across the city, you could do something like that. That could be a recommendation.
We would want to include that in our study, and we are.
Okay.
The key here is that we want to produce a recommendation that is cost-effective and also
I understand the cost-effective requirement, yep.
Yes, and also creates the highest impact for the goals in our climate action plan.
And that can also be phased as well, right?
Absolutely. I'm not sure if I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, but the city can actually adopt a REACH code at any time. The impulse to adopt one now is to, again, try to catch the next code cycle.
And just so that I'm clear here, the recommendation on the screen we're seeing right here, the recommendation, for instance, for multi-unit dwellings, is that 25%, or is that still being discussed, whether it's 10 or 25% for the number of spaces?
Yeah. So this chart is illustrative because the There's more combinations of building type when you're looking at EV charging. So I would look at this as directionally correct, but not specifically correct for any one building type.
Yeah.
So the actual language for the EV charging would be the most effective place to look for the real recommendations.
Okay.
So we've created, again, a template, but we are serving 13 agencies with our recommendation, and many of the cities that we're serving are very different between the demographics of the city. So we definitely recommend that you look at our recommendations and then adjust them based on what your pipeline of construction is going to look like and where you're going to have the most impact with it.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Any more questions from commissioners? If not, let's go to the public.
Thanks.
All right, cool. First person up, Jennifer Griffin.
Good evening, Planning Commission. I'm Jennifer Griffin. It's always interesting to hear presentations about current and future trends. My first question I had was, in some areas such as the Santa Cruz Mountains, most people have propane or butane. My cousins all grew up in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and they had natural gas tanks outside the house, which I guess we were kids, we didn't really know what was going on. They didn't have any television, but they always had, my uncle was always getting natural gas things. They always had stuff outside. So how does this affect areas, and there might be areas in Cupertino where people have to use natural gas. How does these REACH codes affect that type of building construction? I know even up by Lexington Reservoir, people back there have to have, even close into Los Gatos, a lot of people have natural gas tanks by their house. Also now, where a lot of people and places are getting generators for backup. A lot of people in Santa Cruz for many years have had backup generators. Are those using natural gas? How are we dealing with that? We're being, now because there may be power outages, people are recommended to get generators. How do hospitals handle their generators? And a lot of tech companies will have a backup generator system for critical systems, IT. I mean, I went through Y2K in 2000 we actually went through Y2K in Mountain View, handling Palo Alto and Mountain View and Sunnyvale's rollover, trying to keep SGI and very, very expensive engineering stations up. So people need to have backup generators. So how is this affected? The other thing I would say too is, because of what's happened, because of the housing bills from Sacramento and the ADU bills, if we're looking at doing this in January of 2020, I'm really nervous about this. I am very, very gun shy of anything that's coming down that the public has not had any idea about. We need to have more public outreach. And in this situation, I think January is a little early. We need to have a lot of outreach to the public. I have a lot of questions about this. I can understand that this is very, very important. I have a chemistry background. My bachelor's degree is in biochemistry and chemistry, and I did take all the hard chemistry. So I'm just saying at this point, because of the problems where the public, especially in Portland, they didn't know that HB 2001 had been passed. We need to make sure that there's more outreach. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, Rhoda Fry, then Dashiell Leeds, and Gary Latshaw.
Hi, good evening. I'm Rhoda Fry. I'm a professional member of the United States Green Building Council and of Build It Green and of Passive House, California. And I'm here representing myself. I am a proponent of abandoning natural gas, especially for new construction. I'm glad to hear that there is some flexibility in extending the Silicon Valley plan. For one thing, for years, forever, Cupertino has had minimal compliance for Cal Green. Compliance means meets minimum standards, while our neighboring communities have gone tier 1 or tier 2. And tier 1 and tier 2, these are merely prescriptive enhancements to Cal Green. It's pretty easy. So I would be a proponent of doing Cal Green tier 2. And I certainly do not like the idea of rewarding a builder for going electric only and then going for baseline, right? If you go electric only, we also need tier 2 because we are in a climate crisis. Let's get that clear. We're in a climate crisis and we need to be doing better as far as energy use. Climate warming is about energy use. So the next part is, when I wrote to you earlier today, I rambled to you earlier today regarding doing passive house standards. And what passive house standards are is it basically takes what the Department of Energy has done and it enhances it. And what it does is it enhances the building envelope. It makes your building envelope more energy efficient. So it's kind of what you might have heard the term continuous insulation. So that is kind of like if you wear a polar fleece jacket and you go outside, you will get cold because the air goes through it. So the way to do it is you want to have a polar fleece jacket and you want to have a shell on top. And you want to make sure it doesn't have a lot of holes in it. So that's where you get your that's called your building envelope. And the only time to get your building envelope done is when you're building. It's really hard to do it later. So to go with baseline for electric only is simply not acceptable in this day and age. So we need to really ramp up the energy efficiency. The other thing that's very cool is that if you have a building that has been built tight, and then what you do is you can use a HRV heat recovery ventilator to bring in fresh filtered air, and it works great. And the benefit is that if you have an energy efficient envelope, you don't need as much area for your solar. So you can even build tall buildings and have plenty of room for solar because your building uses less energy. And using less energy is good for climate change. Thank you.
Thanks, Rhoda. Passive house. Dashiell leads. Hope I pronounced that properly.
Yeah, it's Dashiell, but you can call me Dash as well.
Dash, okay. Nice. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm a conservation assistant for the Sierra Club Loma Prieta chapter. I'd like to talk a little bit about just sort of the big picture scale of where we're heading as a species. The IPCC has said that the next 18 months will be critical in determining whether or not our species will actually meet the crisis of climate change, whether we can actually survive through it. And then when I look at the escalating natural gas emissions in this city, it really worries me, especially when I consider that gas infrastructure is really hard to get rid of once you put it in the ground. It's really a huge liability. And once those pipes are underground, those pressurized gas pipes, they're going to be constantly leaking methane into our atmosphere. And those leaks have been sort of not thought about in the past, back when we had this sort of delusion that natural gas was a cleaner alternative to coal. But when you take into account these persistent leaks, it actually really turns out that in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, that natural gas is just as bad, if not worse, than coal. And then even on a local scale, when we turn on our gas stoves in our homes, we're releasing carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, formaldehyde. These are really, really harmful chemicals, ultrafine particles. Levels of indoor air pollution that if they were recorded outside, the EPA would find them illegal. They would not meet their standards. And I think a lot of us don't know this, and we have really high asthma rates, so there are health costs that aren't really being brought into the equation as well, both in the short term and long term. So all of the data really points to all electric as being the solution. And once we put natural gas out there, it's going to be really, really hard and really, really expensive to get that out. And we absolutely need to. We 100% need to if we're going to survive through climate change. So we know it's the right thing to do to build all electric. So now's our decisive moment. Now is really our opportunity to just ban natural gas in new construction. It's better for residents, it's better for developers, it's better for future generations, it's better for our ecosystem. So, and to top it off, it's actually a very simple and elegant solution. You don't have to tweak with compliance margins. The code language for that would be pretty straightforward, and developers would know going into their projects exactly what is expected of them without even doing modeling. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Gary Lardshaw, is that correct?
Good job.
And then Lisa Warren, and then Rahul Vasant.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today.
Please go to the mic if you can.
Okay, thanks for the opportunity to talk. I am on the Sustainability Commission, as some of you know, but I'm speaking for myself. We haven't come to a formal conclusion on this. But we do have a crisis. I'm going to elaborate on the extent of that and the urgency. So I come to you as a member of the Sierra Club, but mostly because I'm the grandfather of 4 preschoolers who are going to suffer already the mistakes we've made. Somebody more elegant than me, Phil Alston, he is what they call a rapporteur, I believe you say it, a UN special person who evaluates. He went to the climate discussions and he kind of summarizes it. So his summary was very blunt. We have reached a point where the best case outcome is widespread death and suffering by the end of the century. And the worst case puts humanity on the brink of extinction. Okay, so this is something of utmost seriousness that has to be taken with every opportunity we can. One of the drivers is the melting of the Arctic ice. If the Arctic summer ice disappears, then it'll change much of the whole ecological system. Right now, that ice is like the closed freezer on hundreds of gigatons of methane. You've heard that methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas. This is a recent report that's come out of the National Ice Agency of some sort. The blue line is where we are today. The blue line was following the lowest extent of ice on record until just last month. So what happened in 2012, September 2012, there was a storm in the Arctic. Probably none of us noticed, I didn't. And that caused the least ice extent. If the ice melts and the methane that it's keeping trapped, frozen below, then we will probably likely reproduce the conditions on what's called the Paleocene-Ecocene thermal maximum. Temperatures were about 8 degrees warmer. All the ice melted. The Earth had no permanent ice. The oceans rose about 200 feet. This is something that's already happened in Alaska with these dogs running through water instead of ice. This is how our country would look at 200 foot of ice. The occurrence would happen 300 times faster than what had happened before. So I encourage every measure possible, including full electrification, to be done to discourage the use of fossil fuels. These people are going to pay for it. These are my grandchildren. She's feeling better, thank you. So just looking at the figures in the 2015 inventory, current costs to pull that out of the atmosphere are in the trillions of dollars. And we're doing that every year.
Thanks, Gary. We're out of time, but appreciate your input.
Thank
you for your 3
time.
minutes. Okay, Lisa Warren, followed by Rahul and followed by Scott. So.
Rahul had to leave. He had to go to another meeting, so he won't be here.
Okay.
So I would just like to add, I was listening to some ADU plans for streamlining ADUs and asking a couple questions that I never really got answers to because staff didn't have the answers yet. And maybe they do now. But I have a concern that ADUs aren't included in the residential, and I think they should be. Anything you recommend or give input on, which brings something else up, I see that it's to provide input is your task for tonight instead of provide direction, and I'm wondering why that is, but anyway. When you provide input, I hope you provide input that says ADUs should follow suit for any residential. I don't believe that ADUs should be treated differently than a single-family home of maybe a larger size and maybe not a larger size. And that was my question back in the ADU discussion about required fire sprinklers, required underground utilities. And it sounds like they get a pass unless the primary residence has those things, they don't have to comply. And that's a requirement for new construction in this city, so I don't know why ADUs would be left out of that requirement. And unless the guess of my answers to my question were wrong, that is the case, and I think that's very wrong. An ADU needs to be treated just like a single-family home, including anything you decide to give input or recommend tonight. Thank you.
Scott Shaw. Thanks, Lisa.
Good evening. Thank you all for working on this. I really appreciate it. I'm Scott Shaw with EHDD Architects. We're a 65-person architecture firm. We've been doing all-electric buildings since 2001. We've done a dozen or so. When we started, there was a cost premium, but in the last 10 years or so, that's gone away. We're bidding out projects both ways. We're getting pricing from contractors with gas or electric systems, and they're coming back equivalent. On one recent project, we did that, and we were able to eliminate a $73,000 gas line to a school, so the school saved that money. We sign the drawings. We're responsible for them. I get the calls if there's anything that goes wrong. And so we have to be very conservative about this. And so when these REACH codes started being discussed, I reached out to all my colleagues, engineers, architects, talked to them, interviewed, are we ready to do this as an industry as a whole? And the answer was yes. And so there's a lot of people out there that are doing this and ready to do it. I submitted a bunch of projects via email. I would encourage you to go to require all electric. Menlo Park has a really interesting approach, kind of like the 2A option, where they're requiring all electric, but they're making exceptions for the things they just couldn't get over. So that's like a gas stove, fireplaces, maybe a gas generator.
Barbecue?
The barbecue. The reason they are doing that, they cited in their staff report, Sonoma Clean Power has been offering very generous incentives to go all electric, over $5,000 per home, above and beyond everything else, plus the $5,000 or more you can save. And only a third of the people have taken it because they wanted their stove or their fireplace, and just inertia. Inertia is so powerful. So I can tell from the Tesla comment that this city can deal with the learning and education that goes with the new technology. It's a better technology. We've done it, and we need to require it. That compliance margin is not enough. We're required by many of our clients to design 20% better than Title 24. The University of California does that. They're our largest client. They now require no gas for heating and hot water for all their projects, all 10 campuses, housing, offices, academic. They did it because they were worried about having to retrofit their buildings and rip all that gas infrastructure out. California's committed to carbon neutrality by 2045. That's 25 years away. So if we're building this into our buildings now, we're going to be retrofitting them in a few years. And that's much more difficult and much more expensive. Putting it in at the beginning is cheap and cost effective, and I'd really encourage you to go on a strong all-electric requirement, not allow the mixed fuel option, and then make exceptions if you have to. Menlo Park also made exceptions for research labs and for emergency facilities.
While you're up here real quick, for restaurants, what did you do that need gas and
so that's
40,000 BTU burners and that kind of stuff?
That's a controversial one. I think that's a little bit behind the rest of the building types. Much of the country is already all electric. In my home state of Florida, the majority of restaurants are already all electric. The technology is there, but the cultural acceptance is tough. There's a half dozen I know of in the Bay Area, so it can be done technically, but the key thing is to get the majority of buildings off, and if you have to provide an exception for that, you can do it. But technically, we know it can be done, and I can provide examples.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
And would love to talk to you about net zero energy buildings at some point for commercial.
We've done a bunch.
I know you have. Thank you. Okay, that's it for public comment. Anybody else? Do we have any more cards? Any comments? All right, commissioners, any questions, any suggestions to take to council or take to the Sustainability Commission? Commissioner Ward?
I'd like to hear some statistics about our amount of restaurants that we have in Cupertino. I was told that 95% of our new retail is restaurants here, and they use a lot of water. There's a big impact on the sewage system and air quality, and like has been stated, they're using natural gas. So, one, I'd like to know what the statistics are for restaurants and how much increase that we've had. And do we want to start limiting what percent of a mixed-use development would be allowed to have restaurants in them? And then do some verifying if the mixed-use developments which had development agreements at one point are actually adhering to those agreements. For instance, I know of one complex which had a 25% cap for restaurants, and they were adhering to it. Another one had something in the 40s, and I'm aware that they went past that percentage. So I'd like to hear about that and what kind of requirements, once we have some data about, the restaurant situation, what can we do in order to make them greener? And then, could it be explained why it is that we're just providing staff input rather than a recommendation or direction to City Council? I know it has something to do with the building codes, but could that be explained a little bit?
The current work program is directed the Sustainability Commission to take lead on this process with regard to Cal Green and electrification. All of the feedback received here was very valuable, which we'll bring back to the subcommittee that's been tasked with studying this item. So that's the current work program.
Commissioner Fung, what do you got?
I wanted to follow up on, so first of all, I want to thank everybody for the comments. They were really fantastic set of comments. I was curious, do we believe, Jennifer Griffin commented about homes that are effectively off the grid, they're off of the infrastructure grid. We must have them in Cupertino, I think, when you get into some of the hillside plots. What happens in this particular case, when it's challenging? I mean, I guess, maybe that says you really need to go electric. But I'm just curious whether that, whether there's, how that's envisioned.
Other cities have allowed exemptions for items such as that. Another good example would be hospitals.
Okay, great.
And
then
may I come? Yeah, so as a resident of Boulder Creek, I'm very familiar with the needs up there. Recently, so to be clear, the building code is what happens inside the shell of the structure. So allowing pipes or tanks for backup power is not covered in the recommendations that we put forth. That's not what's happening inside the shell of the building. So a city can certainly make a decision about how they would do that, but that's strictly outside of what's happening in Part 6 of the building code that we're addressing.
So it doesn't, for those cases, as a planning commission, we'll often hear, because of hillside exceptions, we'll hear about homes that are more on the fringe areas of town. This doesn't become something that prevents them from building prevents them from building, or at least, I guess I would definitely give the input. I would hope that there would be appropriate verbiage in there that doesn't prevent that from happening, for somebody who has a lot like that. I've got some comments too. Should I just do those?
Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Actually, maybe another question. I did notice in the draft information from Silicon Valley Clean Energy that ADUs were exempted. Was that on the basis of feasibility from some of these experts. And I think we do some similar things with some of the utility issues here in our regular code anyway.
Yeah, so during the drafting of the recommended codes, this is a topic that came up in every city in this area. And so the question really, I think, gets back to the city. We can draft the code to be whatever we need it to be in this situation. With ADUs, I think there's a balance that a city is trying to strike. And the feedback we receive from the cities is we need more housing units, therefore we want lower requirements on ADUs because we need more housing units because of the housing crunch. So that fed into one angle of input. The other angle of input was similar to what we heard here today, which is we absolutely want them to be adherent to the new building code so that they are better for emissions and better for indoor air quality and so on. There are a couple of technical impacts of that, things such as using a heat pump for water heating. It does require a bit of access to indoor airspace. And so there could be a constraint based on just the physical size of an ADU to try to do some of these things. So again, I think the comments were spot on. And I think this is definitely something that the city's going to have to decide what the priority is and then address it that way within the code.
If I could just suggest in that area, so I completely agree. If you require 700 to 1,000 feet of circulation area for a heat pump water heater, then that's not going to work for an ADU, particularly since it's noisy. But I'm curious whether the recommendation would include a recommendation that ADUs have electric, have an electric water heater, a conventional electric water heater versus a gas one, for instance.
Yeah, so that gets into another challenge area, which is the smaller the building you're constructing, the harder it is to exceed Title 24, and so, or even meet Title 24. Yeah. And so, if you switch to something like an electric resistance water heater, you're effectively creating a penalty that you now need to overcome with some other building system, like insulation or air conditioning or cooking. And it's can be challenging in order to actually overcome that hurdle that you just did by picking an electric resistance water heater. So these are, we certainly can provide some more background information on that as part of our consultation with the city. But yeah, there was not a clear cut, this is absolutely always the best thing to do for an ADU in all situations.
Yeah, so I would just recommend, this is actually my more general recommendation was that I realize that we're kind of early in the process, even though there's not much runway left before the beginning of next year. So one of the things I think the presentations were really great. They would benefit from having maybe a more explicit set of what exactly is being recommended in Cupertino. That would, so one example is, for instance, to touch on ADUs, just so that that's been thought about. Are you recommending, electric, gas? If heat pump water heater is not possible. And I think I would actually say the same thing with regard to, we kind of had an extended discussion around EV charging. It would be great to know exactly what is the multi-unit recommendation that was coming forth. I think that's coming if it's based on feasibility. That's very important. You don't want to cause the housing not to be built as a result of these requirements. But one of the other things I would add in, because there was some interest here about level 3 charging capability. Of course, there are different ways you can do incentives to build, and one of those would be, that you don't require a large-scale commercial building to have a level 3 charger, but you offer an incentive. And I would hope that you would consider something like that in the recommendations that come forward. This area in particular, there's a pretty good understanding. There are many places where, because there are not public chargers of high-capacity public chargers, you charge at home. And this might be one of the places where people would think differently about that if the opportunity were there. So I would just encourage you to, make that part of the things that are brought to the council to consider. I think that's it.
I wanted to add a little bit. If it's possible that there's some way to get the short-term rental properties to need to comply with these codes, that would be great. And I just want to reiterate the schedule that you're on. You mentioned the draft ordinance, October 9th, public outreach, October 16th. The first reading at City Council would be in November, the second would be in December, and it would be adopted January 1st, 2020. And from what I'm hearing, it sounds like Cal Green Tier 2 is, I think we're seeing the most support for that among the comments that we've heard this evening. Okay, that's all.
Okay. I'm just going to add two things I think is really important. I want to understand those metrics by populace. I think it's a very important comparative tool, and also by square footage in terms of commercial square foot. So residential, non-residential square foot. I think you'll get some very interesting normalization of that data between cities, and I think that'd be cool to look at. And the second thing is really about looking at exceptions. And I think I've read enough codes from a lot of different places. The ones for barbecue, which is a big one for some folks, power generation, cooking, and to see what the impact is on restaurants. I'd like to see what the technology is to be able to fire 40,000 BTU watt equivalent, wok equivalent in some of these restaurants around here. It'll be interesting to see what happens. So thank you. Thanks for a great presentation.
So I left one thing. I had one thing left on my my notes here. Rhoda Fry, who I think is out in the thing, had mentioned talking about having efficient construction. I attended a presentation, Silicon Valley Leadership Group presentation about that, and they were actually talking a lot about things like changing the way you insulate the roof. Can have an enormous energy advantage, and that actually means that the heater, whether it's electric, whether it's a heat pump, or whether it's fossil fuel, can be smaller. So I would encourage, to the extent that that's possible, and I realize that those are not, that probably haven't been formalized in the REACH codes that are out there today, to talk about some of those construction techniques can improve the efficiency of the home, because that actually there's a great opportunity there. Yeah, and I think as Rhoda very aptly pointed out, it's not a retrofit opportunity, but it's those are things that can really be done as in any new construction.
Commissioner Moore?
If we could actually add in a roof policy that would address having a white roof, a green roof, and solar, I think that would be beneficial as well.
Okay, looks like we have no further comments. We'll close out this agenda. Thank you, staff. Thank you, John, for coming out here. Really appreciate your presentations. Thank you to everyone else for your comments. I'd like to suggest a 5-minute recess, real quick, bio recess, and then we'll come back here at 8:20 and take on agenda item number 2. Thanks, everybody. All right, welcome back. For those who are following along on TV land, we are on item number 2, study session on the general plan annual review implementation plan. The recommended action here is to provide direction on the format of the general plan annual review implementation plan, and we've got a staff report. So let's go to Ben.
Sure. Thank you. Again, Ben Food, Director of Community Development Department. This item is before you today to receive some comments and direction and input that you may have. We went to the City Council on April 2nd as our annual general plan review implementation process, and the council wanted us to take a look at it, the format-wise and the content and things like that with the commission, to see if there's any improvement that we can make to make it a little bit more clear, for lack of a better term, if you will, for the public. So with that, we have our planning manager, Pugh Ghosh, here to provide a brief presentation, including a background and information on a particular item. And we're happy to take any comments at that point. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, Chair Wang and Planning Commission. Ben introduced this topic wonderfully, so I'll just jump right in. We are required by state law to present a status update to the legislative body of the city with regard to general plan policies, goals, and strategies in it. And we've been doing that since for quite some time annually. The other thing that the state law requires is that the housing element update be submitted on forms to the HCD by April 1st. And this was presented to the City Council at its March 19th, 2019 meeting, I believe, prior to submittal to HCD. There are several mandatory elements of a general plan, and we have several of these, which are 6 mandatory elements that we have. We also may be subject to new environmental justice policies, but I don't believe we have any disadvantaged communities within our city boundaries, but we haven't done that analysis necessarily yet. So there might be some new policies that may need to be adopted at a later date. With regard to optional elements, we have our infrastructure element that kind of addresses long-term goals that the city might have with regard to the infrastructure that the city has. And so those are all areas of study that are within our general plan. The annual review is done on the basis of an implementation plan. In general, plans is a listing of all the policies and strategies within a general plan. And many of these implementation plans in general have timeframes that are attached to them. Some cities use this as an opportunity to identify work program items so that you can decide what gets done when. Some cities also identify dollar amounts attached to those work program items so that councils and commissions can prioritize how and when those get done. In Cupertino, in particular, we have general timeframes identified for the programs and policies in our general plan. Most of the policies are implemented on a continuous basis through development review. These are through municipal code requirements. There are other land use plans and our adopted manuals we have, such as the below market rate housing manual that we have. And then policies that have specific action items, they have timelines identified periodically, and then they're brought up to the City Council as work program items within that time frame. And then if City Council wishes to allow staff to proceed on that particular work program item, it gets incorporated into the work program. For example, this could include development of an ordinance, policy, a program, and then for Cupertino in particular, the budget is determined in compliance or in conjunction with the work program review, as opposed to being identified up front within the implementation plan. So we took the general plan annual review to the City Council, and council direction was to include updates on items and to present it to the Planning Commission prior to bringing it back to the City Council, which is why we're here. So I'm keeping it short. In essence, the next steps are to receive comments from the Planning Commission as far as the format of the current implementation plan is concerned, and then we'll bring it back to review prior to presentation to the City Council next March. With that, I conclude my presentation, and I'm ready for any questions.
Okay, thank you. Commissioners, any questions? And if, for those in the public, if you've got comment cards that you want to fill out, please do that at this time.
So I was watching the April 2nd City Council meeting earlier, and so they were looking for narrative updates on each item. There's about 150 or so pages that we have. So I was wondering what the narrative updates are that they are looking for. Would you have any comments on that?
Yes and no. The ones that are implemented on an ongoing basis, ideally, I don't think we would include a narrative update on each of those items because those are implemented as a matter of course through development review or through permit issuance or through conditions of approval or what have you. They're just incorporated into a project, and when it is reviewed, we make sure that those are incorporated into a development project. So they're ticked off as ongoing, as something that staff is doing on a regular basis when they're reviewing projects.
Could you give some examples of what those might be?
Yes, just give me 1 second as I pull this up. Okay, actually, one that I can come up with is, for example, in the housing element, it talks about implementing the density bonus ordinance. We implement that as a matter of course when somebody comes in with an application that includes a density bonus piece. We would just make sure that it complies with the density bonus ordinance with whatever is being proposed. Some of them are, of course, softer. There's softer policy language, which says encourage such and such thing. And we would certainly, when we comment to an applicant about that, we would say, the general plan says this about this particular thing. It encourages this. We encourage you to look to incorporate this particular thing within your development. So as far as those items go, to the extent that we can implement them without them being something as straight up as, you shall have a one-to-one building slope line along Stevens Creek and De Anza or whatever, that is something that is implemented slightly differently than something that has softer language. But those are things that we do identify, and we do let applicants know that this is what the general plan encourages, and you might look to do this. So those are things that we do on an ongoing basis.
Okay, so I actually have a question about where our general plan actually is. To my knowledge, it exists in 3 locations, 3 different city council ordinances. One from December of 2014, one from April or May of 2015 after it came back from HCD, where City Council adopted Chapter 4. And then again, there was an amendment in October of 2015. So to me, those 3 documents comprise the general plan. And then when I go and look at other cities' general plans, it looks as though they have an entire document which was approved by their city council at once. Is my understanding of where the general plan exists correct?
No, actually, the general plan is posted online. The City Council resolution from October 2015 allowed authority to make formatting and edits to the general plan prior to posting on the website. So as a result, after the City Council adopted the October 2015 document, there were some layout changes made, and I don't believe there were any wording edits that was as reflected in the October 2015 resolution, and then posted on the website.
Okay, so I was wondering if you could point to where I could find the land use map in the general plan?
The land use map is actually posted on the GIS website. It's at cupertino.org/GIS, and there is the general plan land use map posted there.
Okay, so is there a reason why it was attached to or included in the October 2015 general plan amendment, yet not put in the general plan?
No, there is no reason for it not to be there. It just made sense to be where the maps were all together, but we're happy to add a link to that on our website.
Well, actually, I would prefer that it was added to the general plan. One of the things that I noticed when I looked at Mountain View's general plan is that they had adopted it perhaps in 2010 or 2011, but at the start, they had their they were blue lined, but they had their changes to the general plan up front, so you could see things that had changed in 2015, and that's something that I would, a recommendation that I would like to see here is that we can see what's changed since 2015 and have it all in one place in the future.
Just for clarification, the difference between what was adopted in 2014 in December and it must have been October of 2015, that modification, red lines were produced for that.
Yes, the
for that
city council
effort.
packet did have
Yes.
red lines produced for that effort, yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think that was actually, at the time, that was actually my understanding of the point of this was to highlight the differences, that were happening, I think there was discussion about a different one, which was, a much harder effort, which was what are the differences between 2005 and 2014.
Correct. What we actually ended up doing was, if my recollection serves me right, is that there was a mapping exercise in terms of where the 2005 policies ended up in the 2014 document and then what edits were made to the 2014 document to the 2015 document. So there were several spreadsheets related to that, if I recollect.
I was wondering if you could say when the online form of the general plan became available?
My understanding is that it was produced between, we had to engage consultants in order to do the layout because we didn't have in-house expertise, but my understanding is that it occurred between, there was I want to say it was posted by March 2016, is my understanding, by the time it was all posted online.
So going back to what the exercise here is for, it's a study session coming down here. I mean, are there certain things we're supposed, this is the general plan as is. The recommended action here is to make this easier to read or make it easier for the public to understand or to help city council. I mean, if that's one of these items, then I'd say let's put the land use map in there, right? But what else was suggested here?
I think Commissioner Moore kind of started to talk about that, in which, we were trying to figure out what the narrative descriptions were. I suggested, again, just to reiterate, that for the ones that are being implemented on an ongoing basis, that narrative descriptions not be required for all of those because it would be a huge staff effort in order to put that in. But with regard to any specific action items that involve the development of policy or have been started, those kinds of things, we could certainly add some descriptors in terms of whether it, which year it's incorporated, which work program it was incorporated in, when it was completed, for example, or what is the anticipated date of adoption of any particular policy from the current work program.
I mean, there's something like 400 ongoing items going in this general plan. So.
Correct.
So, okay.
If I could comment on that, first of all, I'll say that I had a discussion with Ms. Ghosh yesterday about this. So I actually reviewed this in fairly good depth. And what I was seeing, I think I would categorize what you see here are there are a number of there are corrections that reflect organizational changes at City Hall. So for instance, the Economic Development Department moved from the Community Development Department to City Manager's Department. The location, park improvements moved to Public Works from Parks and Rec. I actually think that the modifications, you can put these things one place or another. They all seem to make good sense. So one set of the modifications, the red lines here, are reflecting the change in organization. But I think that the issue that I raised was that there's sort of two different reports here which have intermingled results. And so I would actually say that there's one report which is items for which programs are being developed to carry out the general plan objectives, right? So, so the economic development plan would be an example of such a thing. The climate action plan is an example of such a thing where the general plan called for a change, and there needs, and the response to that is that there would be a major staff effort to produce such a report. There's another class of things here which are things where there's effort put forth by the staff to implement the policies that exist here. And those typically got marked with ongoing. And the example, she stole my example, which was around the bonus multiplier, the density bonus multiplier, is marked in here as an ongoing effort. In fact, unless the state were to make a change in the density bonus multiplier policy, there is no staff development, there's no program development associated with that. So from my standpoint, if I were looking at this, I think the way that this list becomes useful is to understand where, to understand where are the efforts that are leading to policy change, and separate that from what are the things that the staff is executing on an ongoing basis. They would, for instance, use staff time to review any application that came through, and that's actually true for everything in the general plan. Any project would be reviewed for general plan compliance across the board. So in theory, you could say that everything is ongoing. But I think that the really important part is when you make that distinction, then for many of these items, and the example I used for that one was actually, it was repairs for affordable housing. Let me see, it was maintenance and repair, item 225, was to provide funding for maintenance and repair of BMR projects. There is not going to be any policy change there. It is just something that we do. So I would actually treat that as something which was completed. And I would actually say that many of these hundreds of items are actually items where the form in which they exist today in the general plan and the municipal code are unlikely to change, and I would therefore mark those as completed items. But they continue to use ongoing time, to test for compliance and to advise, to advise any project that's coming through for approval. The goal of that, the advantage of dividing the list into two kinds of lists like that, and so part of that is that there were 3 time bands. There was kind of a past time band, the current time band, and then the future, 2022 to 2040 time band. What would happen there is you start to identify, well, the climate action plan goes in the first bin because it's done. There are things that are being worked on today. ADU development, for instance, is being worked on today. So that would be in the current bin. And then there are things which we know we need to work on but aren't being worked on yet, and those would go into the future bin. And I think that then this, when things are divided in that way, there is a benefit to the council because that helps you understand. I think that the question they're probably asking is around, of the things you are doing, are the priorities, are the priorities correct? And that would help clarify that. I mean, they know that you're going to be on an ongoing basis measuring compliance with the general plan. So I think that actually has the effect of, kind of reducing the noise level, making it easier to see what's being worked on, what kinds of things, and if somebody wanted to reprioritize, that would help illustrate that. I think also from a resource standpoint, as a manager, I would look at this and be concerned that 80 or 90% of the items here are ongoing, but there are some that are completed, which it has the appearance then I'm trying to do 400 things at the same time today, and so I will comment that when I raised this with Pia yesterday, she did comment that's a separate thing. The work plan actually addresses that directly about where are the resources and dollars going to be put. But I think that this does help. There are many inputs into the work plan, the general plan. The status of the general plan is one of them. So identifying the things which are, these are the ones we're done with, these are the ones we're working on, and these are the ones that we know we need to do but we haven't started yet, that's actually a useful categorization to help inform the work plan.
Commissioner Moore.
Okay, I wanted to talk about the process here a little bit. So looking at the Cupertino Municipal Code, powers and functions of the Planning Commission, prepare, periodically review, and revise as necessary the general plan, and annually review the capital improvement program of the city and the local public works projects pursuant to section 65400 et sequitur. So my question is, so you brought to City Council on March 19th the HCD numbers, is that correct?
That is my understanding, yes.
Okay, and then those needed to go to HCD by April 1st.
Correct.
Okay, and then when I look at 65400, it looks like the planning agency shall make recommendations to the legislative body regarding reasonable and practical means for implementing the general plan, which is being done. Provide by April 1st of each year an annual report to the legislative body, the Office of Planning and Research, and the Department of Housing and Community Development, that includes all of the following: the status of the plan and progress in its implementation. So it sounds to me like in March of 19th that the April 2nd report should have gone to City Council, perhaps, that April 2nd was a day late. So we got the regional housing needs met, but looking at a timeline throughout the year, it seems as though the Planning Commission should be looking at, if City Council has directed us to look at the general plan, that we should be well into it by now, and then we would want to be wrapped up probably in December or January, and then get into the CIP review, so that we're not trying to do both of those at the same time. Anyway, this is something that somebody, within city staff and talking to the City Council needs to discuss in order to get the timeline going, so that we've completed our review and it can get to City Council with enough advanced notice. So that is all I have to say about that. Does anyone have any comments about it?
I actually was going to comment, the Planning Commission attends the Housing Commission meetings, so they actually did have a major meeting, which was the review of the housing element performance or production plan. I attended that one. We ended up getting that report after the approval here as well, I believe. So, I'm not sure whether the responsibility for that particular, it's an interesting one because in theory, the Planning Commission has primary responsibility for the general plan. The housing element is part of that, but I think that they actually push that primarily as a responsibility of the Housing Commission to have the public review for that.
I would suggest that we take a more proactive approach going forward. I think that's what's being raised here, in areas where we can actually review those plans earlier and meet those goals. I think it's going to take us a long time. This is not a 1 week process. It's not a 1 month process. There's 566 items on this puppy. So, it's something that we could probably bite off maybe once a month or something like that and go through this to get to the deadlines, and we'd be happy to do that with you.
I think it actually gets a little bit, the project I think is larger than we're realizing. I think we need to look at the economic development plan. We might need to look at the climate action plan. We have specific plans, master plans, conceptual plans. I'd say that City Council really loaded up our plate.
Yeah, Stevens Creek connectivity plan. There's that too. Bike plan, park plan, stormwater plan, a lot of stuff.
It's true. Some of those aren't here, though. The Climate Action Plan is the Sustainability Commission's purview. It comes here for review, as do all these things.
So every commission has its own charge in terms of making recommendations to the city council for final adoption. There are certain plans that are brought to different commissions as a public outreach process. For example, the reach codes were brought here for outreach to the planning commission. So from that perspective, almost every item that, the Parks Master Plan was also, I believe, brought in here for outreach. So to the extent that those documents, the Planning Commission provides input on those documents, staff tries to engage other commissions and departments to make sure that any plans that are relevant to the land use issues that the Planning Commission reviews are brought in for its input. As far as the general plan annual review itself goes, it's really a review of the policies and just where we are with implementation of those policies. We do our general plan update for actual amendments to the general plan policies. Generally in the same cycle as a housing element update, we would kind of, as far as staffing is concerned, we would probably look and involve our consultants and make it a holistic effort once every 5 to 8 years.
Yeah, it's like 2023.
Correct. The next one will be around, I think by the end of January 31st, 2023, we'll have to have our housing element adopted. So we would actually probably look to, review all the policies within the general plan as well at the same time to make sure that we're addressing all up and coming issues.
I think there's a general confusion as to what we're supposed to do in this recommendation. Are we supposed to say, this is the format, it's great, let's move a few columns? Is it like, should we really prioritize this different? Should we put this in a Excel spreadsheet with a macro so we can filter against it, so like people actually see the things that are important, right? I'm just trying to figure out what we're supposed to do here in the recommendation.
Right, this is not really a review of each policy and, talk about the language and what needs to be amended. We should have a policy about something, but it's a great idea to have a policy addressing X versus Y. We should make changes here.
We give council sorry to interrupt there. We give council 150-page implementation plan to look at. Is that basically what we do right now?
That is what this exercise is essentially. This is a state mandate that we're required to kind of review our general plan policies and assess where we are with implementation of them.
And, well, not only do you have the state mandate, but in our municipal code, we are supposed to.
Yeah.
So we're supposed to be doing the review according to the municipal code, and now the city council is asking that we look at it first. So in a sense, they're basically telling us that the periodic review is an annual review now from the Planning Commission. And from my understanding, watching the April 2nd meeting, that the Planning Commission had not in the past been looking at this, that this is something new. Okay, and then I just have a comment about the implementation program, the table, land use and community design. I have just a formatting change that I would like to see, and it could actually shorten up the table a little bit, is that instead of going implements with policies LU 1.1, that you just follow how the general plan has it exactly. So it would say policy LU 1.1, and then the next one is a strategy. So instead of saying implements, for item 2, it says implements which policies. That is actually, I believe, a strategy. So I would prefer it be called, strategy LU 1.2.1. And there were some things that were left out. At any rate, I think that's something that, I can just make an email about that to change how that's designated in the table. Do you have a question where the red lines came from that are in here?
They were made by staff based on department changes, just where names of departments changed and things like that.
Yeah,
it's just
we
reflective
identified.
of that.
I looked at that actually pretty closely, and so we identified two sources there. The vast majority of these reflect changes in the organization, organizations that moved to the city manager's office, and then the other ones, there were a few corrections that were related to low-income housing tax credit. There's one in there where that strangely is struck, even though the text in the general plan talks about low-income housing tax credit. and that was a technical correction.
Correct.
You can cover that if you'd like.
Okay, so is this something that happened in the last 6 months, in the last year, ongoing? When did these red lines occur?
These were the ones that were presented to council at its April meeting. So there have been no changes made to this document. We just kind of presented what we had presented to council at that time.
Okay, so these are red lines that happened between presenting it
Between
last
April
year?
of 2018 and, yeah.
Got it,
Yeah.
okay.
Specifically since City Manager Brandt left, there were organizational changes instituted by the interim city manager, the two interim city managers, and those are reflected in these changes.
Correct.
So I didn't realize, I mean, I think that, Ben, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that economic development moved more recently than some of the others, but
I believe it occurred at the same time as one of the first interim city manager.
oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I would definitely, I mean, I think that Ben and I have had this discussion as well. You know, in the municipal code, the primary responsibility for maintaining the general plan, you know, because we're a general law setting, we're inheriting this from the state template. The primary responsibility for the content of the general plan is actually written to be in the Planning Commission's purview with approval happening at the City Council. But many towns don't do it that way. And I think that that's why, you know, there's a distinction here between reporting that the planning, you know, a report that the city requires and the actual engine that drives general plan amendments.
Charter cities work differently as well.
Yeah, that's right.
I think that's
Yeah,
what
and
you're
certainly
trying to say.
charter cities
Work differently.
very different.
Okay, so what do you want us to do? Should we just email you comments? I mean,
I think that's perfectly fair.
That's perfectly
I mean,
good. Okay,
yes,
well-
and email them to me and
Okay,
Ben. or-
So
and
we're
or
just
Ben.
looking for sort of any input you have.
Okay.
Obviously, we have a resource issue, and also this year has been particularly challenging with the type of projects we have on our program. So any
yeah, I'm just trying to figure like would the suggestion be like, hey, don't send PDFs, like send council an Excel sheet so they can filter and pivot against and save them a lot more time. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm just trying to figure out like what's easier for them to like consume the information.
So we'll have to fit, this is actually laid out in Illustrator, so we'll have to figure out how to export it to an Excel that will be workable, just FYI. So, but that's a
Mechanical
technical
Turk,
issue that we'll
OCR.
work through.
NLP.
Illustrator mean the,
Adobe Illustrator. Oh my God, yeah, exactly.
I have a question going.
Intern project?
Yeah, going back to our staff report, we are to comment, it looks like council members' comments included the following. Reports by neighboring jurisdictions such as Mountain View and Palo Alto should be reviewed as examples for future implementation plans, and additional details should be included for the council to understand the progress being made with the general plan implementation. And I was wondering if we would be able to have a report from what Mountain View and Palo Alto have been doing. When I was listening to the city council meeting about this, they had reviewed, some of the council members had reviewed Mountain View and Palo Alto and what their review process was like, and I'd like to, you know, either have a link to what they were looking at.
Happy to
or-
send that link.
Yeah,
I
that'd be
will
great.
also, Ben brought this up briefly, and I'll mention this too. We do have staffing challenges. Both of those cities that are cited, they both have a long-range planning department of 5 line planners and a planning manager. So I will kind of raise that as, you know, for your consideration, but we're happy to do whatever the Planning Commission wishes for us to do, and I'm sure council will, yeah.
Okay, so, and along those lines, one of our jobs is to endeavor to promote public interest in, comment on, and understanding of the general plan and regulation relating to it. So I think when we start getting into these very granular discussions about particular strategies in the general plan, that we can lose people. So I was wondering if, in light of this municipal code requirement, under our powers and functions, if we can have, you know, a fairly high-level explanation of what our general plan is and what our municipal code is, and and also get into the relationship between the general plan and our zoning ordinances. And, you know, with the even discussing how the three maps that we have, our community form diagram, and our land use map, and then our zoning map, if, you know, some kind of a explanation for the public so that we're all more informed about these. I don't know if you want to put them up on the overhead real quick. Someone, thank you.
I mean, that, or we
Just
could,
show them for a second.
or we could do like an informational video, right, that you can just post on the
Well,
website
I mean,
too as
I think
well.
this kind of explains, if you look, so here's our community form diagram, and I think they're in the land use map, right? And then we've got a zoning map. So I think, you know, if this could be part of a kind of a community outreach and education about the general plan, because that is part of our function. So I think perhaps at the start, if the next time we revisit this, at the start of the meeting, if we were to have a very quick run through, just educational, be very short, just, you know, high level type of thing.
Sure thing.
Boy, do I miss transparencies. Commissioner Fung.
Yes, I was just going to say that there's value in that because I think there's a persistent misunderstanding about the relationship between those three diagrams. You know, there are people who believe that zoning controls land use, and that is not true. So the more we can correct that, the better. I did want to comment. I think that if we were able to, in a list like this, identify the items where there is active work on developing, on developing programs or policy, those are actually the ones that would be worthy of getting the narrative. The ongoing, you don't need to report 350 times that we're testing for compliance with the existing programs. So I think that actually would help. And when that starts to become, 20 items, another thing that would be an interesting thing to consider would be, and you may be doing this, I think you may actually be doing this already in conjunction with the work plan, is the, here's the top 10 or the top 5. That I think is actually, I watched the session that led to this, the council session, and I think that part of that, again, it was an understanding of there's a review that needs to happen, and part of that review that would make it more useful is to understand how staff is prioritizing the many priorities laid out on the table. So, in that kind of if that's what you're trying to administer or manage, having, these are 25 things that we're working on right now, and these are the top 10 or the top 5, actually, it's pretty useful.
I would make actually a suggestion in line to what Commissioner Fung is saying here. I would identify the active projects, which you do. I would identify the high potentials or future potential projects that may be there, and I highlight what was maintenance, right? And I only report on the first 2. And what you might find out, and based, I think it's a little bit more than 25. I kind of went through each one. It was not fun reading on a weekend, but I would say you probably have about 50 items there that you would want to report on an active basis, and the rest, based on compliance requirements, you would just pepper in as needed. And I think that would be my suggestion to you. Right now, now that I know you put this in Illustrator, I'm like, holy bleep. My point being is like, get in an Excel spreadsheet, filter it out so someone can actually do it, so you can print that puppy out and just run a PDF against it. It'll save you so much more time.
Yeah, and do we have any thoughts on the prioritization of the items on there, or should we weigh in, or the city council weigh in on that topic?
I think we should let them weigh in later. So
Yeah,
I kind of wanted to.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with weighing in, although I think that actually happens as a natural part of the work plan. They just don't fund things that...
They don't fund things they don't want to care about.
Yeah.
So.
I would also suggest if you give us an opportunity to take a stab at what you're suggesting, and when we bring it back again,
I wonder if
shortly,
you can
we
OCR
take
that
a
into
look
an
at
Excel spreadsheet.
I'm sure it can be done, and we'll figure out.
I hope
a
you
way.
figure it out. I'd like to move to public comment and then get ourselves out of here before 9. Oh, no, we can't do that. I'd like to move to public comment. Let's do that. Jennifer Griffin, please come on up. Everyone okay? So. Be a first.
Good evening, Planning Commission. This has been enlightening as usual. I call it night school for adults by coming, I think it's really important that the public listen to what's going on. A lot of people watch the news at night, or they listen to stuff on their headphones, or they listen to the, apps and things about news, but you need to listen to what's going on in your own city. And I mean, this year has been monumental. With the things coming out of Sacramento, oftentimes a lot of hostile. I'm going to go back again to the housing bills, the ADU bills. Hostile to the cities, hostile to the suburban area, hostile to citizens. I don't know if the Sacramento lawmakers realize that, but they're coming across as hostile. So, and I'm going like, gee whiz, what kind of new housing and ADU bills are we going to get next January? We're going to have SB 50 coming back again. I guess it got saddled down for another couple months, but we're going to have reincarnation Dracula bills coming back. So we need, this. I remember the first time I went through a general plan review, which is 2005 in this building. It was like a real eye-opener. Not that I was awake most of the time, but the general plan is sort of the working constitution of the city. And obviously, I will say right now, I've been coming to these meetings since 2003. This year has had more upheaval and challenges to the city's constitution than I have ever seen before. I mean, and there has been a lot of stuff that's happened, believe me, since 2003. We need to proceed cautiously. I understand that the City Council had referred this back to the Planning Commission. I was actually there when they did, and I'm trying to remember why, but I think it's good. The more discussion that we have about this, the more that the public understands what's going on, the better. It is education for adults who think that they've stopped going to college or taking continuing courses. I think that in this situation, there are so many terms. We've had the housing element, the HCD, the RENA, the sub-RENA, which is being formed now, bills from Sacramento. Like you said, I don't know if people realize that the city of San Jose has 300 people in their planning department. That is staggering. When you talked about future planning, it's just our staff that have to do this. So if you look at HD 2001 in Oregon, they said that even if you have poor cities with poor infrastructure, you have to build on that land. So that is panacea land. So we need to watch what happens in Oregon. People are prepared to fight back. We may be having to do this now and next year. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Lisa?
Thank you. So a couple of you brought up some things that I'd like to comment on, and I may be going back and forth in a weird way. So my feeling as a person who does look online and does try to find information that way, because it's often in the middle of the night when you can't speak to a person, but you shouldn't need to look, in my opinion, at multiple documents to put together what comprises a full document. Like 3 different documents. Oh, I have to look at this and I have to look at this, but if I didn't catch that, I don't even know I have to look at that. We're talking about a 20-year document, and it really needs to be all in one place. And that hasn't been the case since 2014. It's still not the case. And it's been brought up several times, and yet no steps are taken to correct it. And I think Commissioner Moore was alluding to that, but I can tell you it's not good. And I actually participated in one session back in 2014 when what was presented by staff as being a cleanup, when really it was a rewrite of the whole dang thing. And I don't believe the proper input was given by the community for that, based on what was given prior development of a general plan. So then there was a scramble and and an agreement to meet with some individual residents to go over things pretty much one by one and clean up the cleanup. And I sat a couple hours as part of one of those sessions, and some of the requests that were made by residents to change some language that had been changed was, oh, we can't do that. Okay, why? And some of them was, oh yeah, we can do that, but it doesn't really matter. We can't enforce it anyway. That to me, when I heard the comment, softer language, it brought that back. And I think a lot of the language is too soft and not enforceable per staff or staff at the time. And why is that? It's a general plan. It's supposed to be the constitution of the city. It should be enforceable, and it should not be wishy-washy. And I feel like it still is, and you got to go too many places to find the pieces. And if you get the wrong piece, God forbid, it can create problems. Why is it still that way? Educating the public is a huge thing, and there was a reference to land use versus zoning maps. Well, there's also should be a reference from general plan versus municipal code, because there was a huge misinformation sent out that the general plan would allow 45-foot residential homes. But if you look at the municipal code, which is the driving code, that's impossible unless you have a very large lot, when you consider all the parameters you have to meet. Yet that was perpetuated by developers, city leaders, former city leaders, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, in a very politically charged year, and we all know that. Part of that, and then part of the problem we have with the SB 35 and other things that are come down the line is that we have too loose of language. That needs to be fixed, and it needs to be all in one place. So when a judge looks online and finds a map and thinks it's the correct map, and it's not, and the judgment in court is based on that, that's an issue, and you should all be worried about that, whether it was...
Lisa, we're almost out of time.
Okay. And I question also when the final combination, which never really was combined, of December 2014 and October 2015 was posted online, and why it took so long. I think there was a time frame given, and it didn't happen. And now I question whether this March 2016 guess is even accurate.
Lisa, we're done.
Okay.
You're out of time. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
All right. Okay, I think we're concluded the study session. Thank you, staff, for presenting. Appreciate that.
I have a couple comments.
I'd like to get out of here, dude. What comments do you have?
So just so it's not ambiguous, I actually have the date of the most current general plan is 11/30, 2016. I'm not sure that that's actually, whether that's in it or whether that's the date that it was published by the city. But that is the only general plan. All previous general plans are overridden.
It's November. I've had to.
Yes,
So I think that's
November 30th.
Can we investigate that and see what's going on when it actually was merged? November 30th, 2016 is the date I have as well, and which Commissioner Fung has listed, which Commissioner Moore is also stating, which we should go check in and make sure that we have the right date and see why.
Sure, we
Let's
can
go take a look
certainly
at it.
research
Let's go
that. It might be the general plan land use map itself and not necessarily the actual general plan document, but we can look at it and review it.
I believe that was the release date, but there is no ambiguity. The previous documents are replaced by that final version. So there is no ambiguity.
I think that may be, well, let's go take a look at it and find out for sure. Let's do that.
Well,
I mean,
I
but there was-
think I can shed some light on what is the point of this discussion. I think if you would be so kind as to put...
You did a great
So-
transparency action there. It was a good overlay.
So that is from December 2014.
Oh, it's not being shown. Let's see. There it is. Thank you.
Transparency. Okay, this is from December 2014. That is the general plan amendment, community form diagram, LU1, and then the next diagram, community form diagram is from October 2015, right? And then and what you're saying is that this didn't actually become posted until November 30th of 2016.
It was approved in the council before then. But
Sure, but the public, when they would have pulled up the general plan, I can remember waiting on the general plan to look at it. So, okay, thank you.
Okay.
Oh, well, wait, bring it back, I'll tell you what the difference is. The difference being is that you've got this little rectangle on the bottom saying neighborhoods and showing height limit there. And I think that is the contentious issue between those two diagrams.
One has it, one doesn't. So.
But as a matter of fact, today, the second diagram, the November 2015 diagram, is the effective there is no question about what.
The October 2015 diagram is the version that was adopted by the council, which was reformatted into the version that was made available on the website. And there have been a couple of amendments to the land use map that the council has adopted, and that has an November date.
So the land, and on the land use, the recent land use amendments or changes, are those updated right now, or is there a time period before that gets, like, what's the turnaround time?
Generally, we have to send it to our GIS department, and they make those amendments. So between the time that the ordinance gets actually signed, there's a 30-day lead-in for it to actually go into effect.
Okay.
Once it goes into effect, it gets sent to the GIS department that then updates that map. And so there might be, what might be perceived as a discrepancy might be because GIS dates the maps on the day they actually update the map, and not necessarily the date that the council adopts the land use map. So that is reflected in the ordinance, but the posted map might have the GIS map date.
So I'd like to make a suggestion here then, just for clarity, that that something just states adopted on this date, and I think that will help a lot.
Very great suggestion. I will take it back to them.
Commissioner Warren?
Okay, well, I still would like to see the land use map incorporated. I think
into the overall document, yeah. I think that's our suggestion as well.
Right. And so the one that I pulled online was amended in September 5th, 2017, and it does say what the resolution amended it. And we did have, I believe we had a change to it recently, and that after a period of time we'll see that update on the map. And about this, the non-residential land use designations, there might need to be a change on the map as well. And I think if you incorporate the land use map, because you have the definitions of what these non-residential designations are in the general plan, that it would be a lot more helpful to have it together, because when you read this, you don't understand that what commercial office residential means, because the definition is then buried in the appendices of the general plan.
And the municipal code.
But just to clarify that, appending that map would actually require a general plan amendment, correct?
Mm-hmm. We just did.
No, we can add a link to the website, to the general plan, the GIS.
But I think
map
if
that we have.
you're actually talking about embedding it in the PDF document, that would be, I believe that would require approval of the council again. And it could happen on the regular. I mean,
I defer to the city attorney on that issue.
The city council already approved it. This land use map that I'm referring to was in the
last council
2015, October 2015 city council resolution. This was included. It didn't end up in the general plan. There were some other items which I didn't see in the general plan, which were in October, in the October resolution as well. So I think some of what our task should be would include like a consistency analysis, and just a simple, checking the box. If it showed up in October, did it end up in the general plan or not? And to me, if it showed up in October of 2015, the city council has directed it to end up in the general plan, and it has to be there. It's not an option for it not to be.
If you're just talking about incorporating a formally adopted land use map into the existing publicly accessible PDF of the plan. I don't think that would require another amendment. It seems like an unnecessary step, but I can certainly circle back on that.
It really shouldn't. If the other question that I had was whether the general plan exists in 3 locations, in December of 2014, in April or May when the HCD came back and we adopted the Chapter 4, the housing element, and then in October of 2015. If truly what's online is the adopted general plan, then this showing up in October can be added in if City Council, gave permission to make those kinds of adjustments.
Again, I would defer to the city attorney on this. When the council passed a resolution approving these documents, I don't think that said that they needed to be assembled in any particular way. They just needed to be recognized as the correct ones and available to the public.
I think as part of our works program, we're to clean up a lot of the discrepancies in the current general plan, any codes, any things, and I'd suggest that going forward we do that. I mean, I'm not looking towards the past at the moment. I'm saying going forward, let's do that.
And that is something that we've had. We haven't gotten one lately, but we have had general cleanups come in as well. So I don't actually have a problem with that, other than the fact that it will be the normal actions of the council to change the land use plan. I mean, obviously that happened very recently, and that map is now not correct. You would have to generate a new map that would have to go get some form of approval, and then you would turn the general plan again. So I would actually look to staff to make a recommendation as to what the expedient way to do that is.
We would probably just put in the latest version of the general plan map, because that's the one that council has adopted. We would just, as a matter of course, keep replacing it with the most current one that the council adopts.
It's a common issue, I think, that changes are enacted or approved, and then they are visible in the packet in which they were approved, but may not be easily visible. That's something that could be improved, but
Yeah, you're up. Working on.
It's okay, this is working. Okay, so here is a resolution 15-087. This is what I'm referring to, the city council resolution, which occurred in October, so October 20th, 2015, and we just scroll through and we find the land use map. Okay. And also, just as a side note, this heart of the city map, this has been brought up previously. We've got some discrepancies about whether or not Main Street is to be included in heart of the city. So that's just something to be consistent about. Okay, so the point was just to show that this did indeed include the land use map. And here, the amendment that they have is from February 2015. The copy that I have doesn't say February 2015. It says 2017.
I'm going to take us back to the agenda item, and we're focusing on the format piece. So we can discuss this leave this at another agenda item for another time. So let's do that. Okay. Close out this item.
I'm going to raise one more question that came up from public comment. If the general plan land use modified, the height limit was set for an area in the general plan at 45 feet or 80 feet, the existing zoning would need to be conformed to that as a part of that adoption, correct?
I will qualify my answer by saying that the city attorney might have to weigh in, but my understanding is if there is a conflict between a zoning regulation and the general plan regulation, the general plan regulation stands, but I'm sure a city attorney can correct.
I'm going to refer back to the chair's comment that we are far beyond at this point the agenda, the scope of the agenda at this point, and I think we should reserve those comments for a future meeting.
I understand. I think that, a question was raised from the community. A statement was made.
I think the statement was, let's get some education out there. Let's make sure everybody is on the same page on the terminology. I think we're in agreement with that. I'd like to move on to the next item, which is really just any commission reports or any committee reports that's there. I believe the next set of items are not there, so any kind of reports. I'll start with you, Commissioner Moore.
Well, no, I actually don't think that we were finished on deciding what our next steps are in our review, because my understanding from watching the April 2nd meeting was that this was going to take several meetings on our part to go through the items, and so I would like to know what our next steps are.
Organization or the department, let's have it in a format we can all pivot on those and filter on those and so on. So like when you construct the Excel, construct it in a manner where they become columns so that you can pivot on those rather than just being rows and so on.
We can do that. It'll just be harder to present in an agenda format, but we will do our best, certainly.
Okay.
And also, if you could provide the links to how Mountain View and Palo Alto did their review, okay, that would be great.
Absolutely.
Okay, and this will come back as an agenda item in the next 4 weeks, 2 weeks?
Ben?
We'll take a look at it won't be much farther, but we'll take a look at
Okay,
our
good. Just wanna make
forecast.
sure
I
on
don't
time
wanna
frame.
commit to something here, but yeah.
Okay,
definitely
not committing, just
sooner
trying to figure out
than
what the time
later,
frame
yes.
is. Okay, committee reports.
The time that's required, that would be before the next council review next year.
Absolutely.
Okay,
It'll
Before
most
next year.
likely
That's,
be,
that's the critical part for us, I
yes,
think.
it'll most
so that
likely be
we can-
early fall. So as you know, we're finishing up summer now, so be coming to you pretty quick.
Are we done with the items, everyone? If you want to jump ahead, Pete. All right. Committee reports or commissioner reports, go ahead.
Okay, I'll
Commissioner
go
Moore.
first. August 15th, I went to the 73rd anniversary of India's independence flag raising here at the city of Cupertino. On August 16th, I attended the Silicon Valley at Home Fall Lunchtime Forum, which included San Jose Vice Mayor Chappie Jones and Housing and Community Development's HCD representatives from Sacramento, whom I got to speak with. August 17th, I attended the Women's Leadership Policy Summit at San Jose State University. August 25th, I attended the Cupertino Rotary Luncheon. And as a reminder, the Rotary Fall Festival and Crab Feed are both this Saturday, the 14th. On August 22nd, I attended the San Francisco Spur event, The Role of the Region, which featured MTC's Teresa McMillan and Egan Terplen from the governor's office. August 25th, I ran NCEIF's 5K Run for Great Schools. August 27th, I attended the Santa Clara County Board of Supervisors meeting regarding a resolution which supports the development of a complete streets and near-term transit implementation study that includes the consideration of bus, rapid transit, and other modes of transportation and a grade-separated high-capacity transit system for the Stevens Creek corridor that connects the cities of San Jose, Santa Clara, Cupertino, and county facilities, that is supported by and developed in collaboration with the Santa Clara Valley Transportation Authority. August 28th, I attended the Westport presentation. On the 29th, I attended the Sustainability Commission. On September 3rd, I attended the City Council meeting, which had the second reading of the Valco ordinances. On September 4th, I attended the Cupertino's monthly mayor's meeting, which had reports from various commissions. I will not keep going and include all those. September 4th, I attended the TIC meeting, and they spoke about the 5G network. On September 6th, I went to the Cupertino Chamber of Commerce Legislative Action Committee meeting, which included Supervisor Joe Simidian and our own Economic Development Director, Angela Sway. And on September 9th, I attended the Foothill De Anza Board of Trustees meeting regarding the Flint Center. Thank you.
All right, Commissioner Fong.
And a couple of those too. Attended the Westport community meeting the 28th of August, and got a chance to attend the LAC, which was last Friday with Joe Simidian. There was actually a number of interesting things in his talk related to the approval of the new plan at the general plan at Stanford. Actually, somewhat applicable here.
All right, Commissioner Saxena.
Nothing to report.
Okay, I've got nothing to report. With that, I'd like to adjourn the meeting. Thank you, everybody, for watching on TV, and thank you for those in the audience. This meeting is concluded.